Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Iran's foreign minister is threatening retaliation after accusing Ukraine of attacking an Iranian commercial vessel in the Caspian Sea, declaring that Kyiv's actions, quote, cannot go unanswered. The warning comes as Russia continues its largest air attacks in months. Romania intercepts yet another drone near NATO airspace, and President Zelenskyy travels to London for talks with Britain's new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. And joining us now is Andreas Umland, Policy Fellow at the European Policy Institute in Kyiv. Good to have you back with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me again.
So I want to start with the Caspian Sea. I mean, this is seems to be another of the latest fronts potentially opening here. I mean, we have this now threat from the Iranian side, from the foreign minister against Ukraine. What do you make of this? Is this going to escalate? Is this a war of words, or will this be something bigger?
Iran has been an ally of Russia anyway, and Iranian Shahed drones are well known. Infamous, in fact, in Ukraine. So I think the Iranian government cannot really complain here about any Ukrainian action after all it has done to bring sorrow to many ordinary Ukrainians. But I think this story, as well as the story about the shot Russian drones over Romania, illustrate that, of course, this war between Russia and Ukraine is not just a Russian-Ukrainian war. It's a larger war about the European security order, about, in fact, the world order. And it involves also other countries. And the longer it lasts, the more this war will have effects on other countries as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as you rightly point out, I mean, the Shahed drones being given from Iran to Russia, as you rightly said, that's something that has been known, also the Russians manufacturing their own. But such a direct confrontation at the moment, I mean, this does seem to be new. So I'm just wondering, what are the threats and, let's say, dangers if that does come to, let's say, more escalated actions between the two sides?
Iran and Ukraine are far away from each other. I don't think that this will have a significant after effect. So obviously, Iran is not happy about this Ukrainian attack, but the Russian-Ukrainian alliance is rather important for both countries, and both countries are in war de facto or even de jure. And one should not be surprised that then these confrontations come up. And in any way, I think what we are seeing here is also a signal for basically the new confrontation of the 21st century, which is one between democracies and autocracies. Russia has an alliance, informal alliance with Iran. It's also allied to North Korea, to China, to Belarus. And in fact, this is an alliance of autocracies, inter-civilizational alliance, in fact, of autocracies. And on the other side, we have, on the Ukrainian side, we have the coalition of the willing of democracies. And also we have here this conflict between the US and Iran, although that has, of course, many peculiarities. But still, I think it's also a permutation, a variety of this larger confrontation, I think, that will shape the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the United States. I want to get your sense of what's happened, also what might happen. We have President Zelenskyy now is in the UK. He's en route likely to the United States, I think in the next 24 hours for a funeral of the deceased Senator Lindsey Graham, potentially a meeting with President Trump or someone from the administration. Now with this development with Iran, is there, let's say, a way here that you see a bridge? Will Trump maybe welcome more involvement from the Ukrainians somehow, or how do you see this play out in their conversation?
I hope that maybe this confrontation now between Ukraine and Iran, also the different tone from Trump vis-a-vis Zelenskyy, I guess in view of the recent Ukrainian-Russian successes in Russia, Also, the switch of some of the MAGA speakers, influencers, from a pro-Russian to a pro-Ukrainian position. Maybe all of this will then lead to a new start in Ukrainian and American relations. But unfortunately, there's also a strong pro-Russian and, in fact, even anti-Ukrainian faction in the White House. So while I have hopes that maybe this visit by Zelenskyy to Washington will be a step forward, I'm also skeptical in view of the experience of the last 1.5 years during the second Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just come back to what you said earlier. You already alluded to it, the drones that were shot down in Romanian or near Romanian airspace, one actually by an F-16 fighter jet, 3 drones, I believe, in 3 days, as many days. I mean, this comes as well as what already we've seen in Romania in the last couple months. You see this as a spillover that's just bound to happen, or are we looking at something a bit more serious? What's ultimately NATO's response going to be to all this?
One would hope that NATO would more clearly respond to it and also do so in view of the fact that it is unlikely that at the current moment Russia will escalate towards NATO. Russia is busy in Ukraine, and so NATO could be much more forward-leaning in its response to such provocations. We had earlier the intrusion of Russian drones into Polish airspace, which was a much more sort of obvious act against Poland, whereas maybe in the Romanian case, these are just, so to say, is collateral damage from the Russian-Ukrainian war. But NATO should in any way respond to that, and not just in defensive mode, but also perhaps send its own drones in response to such intrusions of Russian drones into NATO airspace, into Russian or Belarusian airspace. Something like that would give a stronger signal towards Moscow. This purely defensive stance, I think, does not help much and will just encourage Moscow to test more the red lines of the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also in terms of Russian firepower, it's been a pretty terrible week for Ukraine. I think Zelenskyy had mentioned in one of his addresses, I think something around 1,700 drones, well over 1,600 guided bombs, 95 missiles fired into Ukraine this past week. I mean, those are still big numbers. I know we're talking about a Russia that seems to be weaker, but still making a very ferocious impact on Ukraine. What do you make of this last week, and what does that indicate for us, what Russia might do next in these next coming days?
I think this barrage of attacks is a sign of desperation on the Russian side, because Ukraine has in the last weeks found a weak spot in the Russian defense and has now conducted a whole number of economically problematic attacks on Russia. And if Ukraine continues this way, this may eventually lead to a major economic crisis in Russia, because the logistic spots and the oil refineries and so on are all sensitive parts of the Russian economy, and Ukraine is picking them and attacking them. And then we have, in response, these often simple terror attacks of Russia, which are meant to perhaps scare and shock Ukraine, and in a way they do indeed shock Ukraine and scare perhaps also many people in Ukraine, but they do not change much in the Ukrainian campaign against the Russian economy and the Russian rear that is now Kyiv's new strategy vis-à-vis Russia.
And just a final quick one, and we have also Andy Burnham, the new UK Prime Minister's first international guest, is actually President Zelenskyy. They're going to be due to meet on Monday. Already Burnham has said unwavering support for Ukraine. We still don't know all that much about his policies, but nevertheless, what do you think of that visit? What's due to be expected out of all this in this relationship between the UK and Ukraine?
That's without any doubt a very positive sign for Ukraine that one of the major Western powers is stable and very committed in its support for Ukraine. And one can only be thankful that various UK prime ministers have shown such demonstrative support for Ukraine, and also thereby given signals to other European countries, to Washington, and to the world in general, that Britain is behind Ukraine. There are also other, of course, very supportive European countries, but certainly Britain's support has a special meaning here because of its outspokenness and because of the international weight of the UK.
And also, speaking of special meaning, I know that the Russians have canceled their annual Navy Day parade, I think, second time round. And I think at the moment also Zelenskyy is touring with the Prime Minister of the UK of some Ukrainian sailors who are being trained for the Black Sea in the UK. So interesting signaling there. Look, thanks so much for that. Andreas Umland there. Always a pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me again.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks. But do stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.